These are some stars who silently slipped out of the NBA without you even knowing, starting with Blake Griffin, who certainly had one ugly ending to his career. Now, nothing about Blake Griffin's game screamed longevity. He was jumping over Kias and Pau Gasol, and was essentially the second coming of Shawn Kemp, who notoriously had one of the ugliest NBA exits in history. But even after all of the injuries and after the Clippers' Lob City failure, BG was a legitimate star on the Detroit Pistons in the twilight of his career. Of course, when we remember Blake Griffin, the first thing we're always going to think back at is the high-flying dunks and the inward gravity of his pick-and-roll duo with Chris Paul, and sadly how kinda disappointing that was. But nonetheless, from a nerd's perspective, Blake Griffin's game is pretty fascinating to break down. Throughout the earlier years of his career, Blake Griffin was an absolute star, earning an All-Star selection in the first 5 years, with the main criticism of his game revolving around the way he settled. Blake could dunk on the best defenders in the NBA, and the post-Dwight Howard NBA left him as the best lob target and roll man in the entire league. But similar to Dwight, Blake wasn't taking enough shots where he excelled, or so he thought. He was an inefficient shooter, an unaggressive scorer, and a poor post player throughout his early years. Although at times his play was ugly, he improved greatly through trying to expand on his weaknesses. Blake was probably at his best in around 2014, where he was top 3 in MVP voting, and throughout stretches without Chris Paul was able to carry this Clippers squad. Although his post-game was super ugly, it was weirdly effective, and with his gravity going downhill and his respectable skill with his back to the basket, it really opened up the floor where he was silently one of the best passing bigs that the game has ever seen. Like I said, Blake came out hot, as you probably remember. He was dunking on guys, it was all fun and flashy, and for 5 years, he was an all-star. But as the injuries racked up, Blake Griffin fell out of the spotlight, lost his spot on the Clippers, landed in no man's land Detroit, and seemed to be all but finished. But this is where Blake Griffin put together one of the most underrated comeback stories in NBA history. I mean, this dude had it all. As a Kardashian boy, first overall pick, playing in Los Angeles with a game that was entirely based around his God-given talent. But after losing his greatest attribute and his leading ability, BG silently put together his best year in the NBA on a small market team in one of the most unique ways possible. After constantly being criticized for chucking threes when he couldn't shoot the ball efficiently and forcing post touches when that was so clearly not his bread and butter, Blake Griffin was dominating the NBA as a stretch big and a dominant post player. At 24.5, 7.5 rebounds, and 5.4 assists, we got to see a Blake Griffin carry job, and really this thing was pretty incredible. And without the leaping ability that he once had, in 2019 we were all talking about Blake Griffin once again, which was a reality that no one really thought possible. I mean, on 36% from 3, on 7 a game, this was a playstyle shift drastic enough to be compared to guys like Brook Lopez. He played in the pick and roll, in isolation, in the mid-post, and utilized short spurts of quickness to beat bigs off the bounce and finish with touch below the rim. It was crazy to see a guy labeled as unskilled throughout his prime, dominating the NBA on skill alone. Unfortunately, with bruised legs, being asked to carry a heavy load, the injuries continued to pile on. And with a defensive game that was already subpar and the steep decline and the last bit of his athleticism dwindling away, Blake Griffin's resurgence was really cut to a 1-year window. As he bounced to the Nets, then to the Celtics, the injuries had hit him with a knockout blow he couldn't get up from, and put the nail in the coffin of his career. But from a Hall of Fame level peak to a resurgence comparable to very few, Blake Griffin gave us a show to watch for quite a while. In 2020, Montrezl Harrell was your 6th man of the year. In 2021, Montrezl Harrell was putting up a fraction of his 2020 totals. And in 2024, he was out of the NBA altogether. This is one that over the years I've had some struggles to exactly pinpoint the issue on, but stick with me if you will, and let me know in the comments on your opinion, because I'm interested what some of you who may have watched more closely might think. Now, the story of Montrezl Harrell's downfall, in my opinion, comes down to one main thing. In the NBA, there are system players and system makers. You have your Jokic's, you have your Morants, your LeBrons, Lukas, the guys that basically have a gravitational pull that every team they will ever play on will revolve around, and every player that plays with them will aim to complement them. Now, this is a rather basic concept. You got stars and role players, but basketball is as complicated of a sport as you want it to be. When it comes to the PG and Kawhi Clippers, their system was significantly different from those of the guys previously mentioned, as with usage spread around a bit, they weren't relying on individual playmakers as much to create for others. Rather, this was just a deep squad of bucket getters that can lean on each other when one guy was off or one guy was hot. On paper, it was a closer system to, say, the MJ Pippen Bulls than it would be the Steve Nash Suns or James Harden Rockets. If you're following, the reason I'm explaining this to you is to explain my theory on why Montrezl Harrell was able to excel in the Clippers system. In a world of system players and system makers, Montrezl Harrell was very obviously a system player, but as an undersized big who couldn't shoot or defend, his player build was in no way the meta of the NBA. But in a Clippers system that had the best wing defenders in the game, a good point of attack defender in Patrick Beverley, and valued shot creation over playmaking, the Clippers were looking for guys who could scrape together buckets rather than penetrate, distribute, and shoot while their defense did the rest. With a hustle-based game, Montrez could push in transition, take advantage of lazy defenses, roll hard, crash the offensive glass, and do little things to put together 18 points a game without the coaching staff having to write him up a single play. It was a rather unique element that Montrezl Harrell could add to the game, which he was ultimately rewarded for with the Sixth Man of the Year award. But as exposed by guys like Kenneth Faried before him, it was a rather inefficient way to play the game. With his career at a high points, Harrell would jump ship to the other LA teams, signing with the Lakers after their championship win. In a microscope, the move seemed to be a win. Harrell was of course a major Energizer bunny for the Clips for a few years, and having lost White and JaVale McGee, the Lakers could use just that. But this is where Harrell's career would begin to fall apart. Harrell's stats would take a significant decline down to 13 points per game because his talents could not be utilized in the same way. Like I said before, there are system makers and system players, and within the Lakers, LeBron was Mr. High Usage with P&R partner and Anthony Davis helping create advantages for him to attack on with his inward gravity. Now in a nutshell, this is the way the Lakers offense would operate most efficiently. And with a very meta NBA offense compared to the Clips, they have since been trying to stack their squad with additional playmakers and 3-and-D style role players, really similar to about 90% of teams in the NBA. And this is where things get murky. Sharing the block with AD, Montrezl Harrell was the best player on the team when comparing individual talent to individual talent, but given that to operate the offense most efficiently, you need to give AD room to operate. Playing less talented lineups with better fit players like Markieff Morris and Marc Gasol gave the Lakers a more cohesive unit. This in a nutshell was the death of Montrezl Harrell. As a role player, when not in a role he can excel in, he quickly drowned. And as a role player who can only fit a very specific role that not many teams want, he, like other similar players before him, were replaced by worse players who can play more efficient basketball. After somewhat reviving his career, scoring 14 points per game on a shitty Wizards squad, although these buckets were scored on high efficiency, the buckets weren't exactly empty, but given what we saw with the Lakers, competitive teams really had very little need for a player of his skill set. In the era of analytics, I think Montrezl somewhat squeaked by in 2020 by finding a role perfectly fit for his style of play. But after jumping ship, finding a system that needed his skill set was harder than he thought. Andre Drummond was at one point one of the best young centers in the NBA. He was a two-time All-Star, thought of as one of the best defenders at his position, the best rebounder since Dennis Rodman, and a guy with a pretty high ceiling all around, I guess. But as of late, people have come to really question this guy's career altogether. First things first, since departing from the Pistons, this guy has been a career journeyman. He's been on a bunch of teams that haven't stuck. He peaked statistically at like 25 years old, and he went on to say he was the best rebounder of all time, which kind of ticked people off. Now, if he wants to say he was the best rebounder of all time, I don't really give two shits. He's probably like top 3. Maybe he's not. Who cares, really? But Andre Drummond as a player has always intrigued me. Now, back since we first saw him, to be honest with you guys, I've always kind of despised Andre Drummond's game. I never was bought into him as an all-star level player. I hated this guy's attitude, and I thought this guy was an overrated defender because of his rebounding. Well, defense is more valuable than rebounding, if that makes sense. Now, recently, Andre Drummond has come out and kind of validated this stance when speaking to a bunch of kids regarding his own downfall.
You know, I understand where you guys are and what's going on. I know a lot of it is new. Some of you guys are coming from respected teams where you're the man, you're that guy on your team, and, you know, you play 100 minutes, you score 1,000 points, X, Y, and Z. This is not what this is, fellas. And the sooner you guys realize is the better. But to be pouting on the bench, making faces, not cheering your teammates on when we're down 8 the entire game, come back and go up by 3, and you're not celebrating that, I'm going to tell you something. Fellas, I was that guy. I was a $100 million guy. I was pouting. I was upset when I wasn't playing. And I had a bad attitude. I went from $100 million to a league minimum. And it's a personal story I'm sharing with you guys right now. They don't care how many rebounds you get, how many threes you make. They care about you being as a person. Are you a good teammate? Are you a good locker room guy? Are you someone they can count on each and every night? I talked about consistency. You play 100% every single time you step on that floor. Consistency, fellas. Consistency.
Now, this is pretty interesting. Most of us remember Drummond's prime that included 2 All-Star selections as well as 16 and 15 averages. Drummond was athletic as shit, he was talented as hell, and he put up some pretty big totals over his time in Detroit. He was a fantasy basketball god, but as a player, Drummond was nothing special outside of his ability to rebound the ball. He couldn't protect the rim to an elite level. He really didn't even try to defend it that well. He wanted to be more than he was, as he would demand touches, try to create for teammates, and score inside the lane, while his touch was not very good whatsoever, and while being super turnover prone in the process. Detroit sucked ass at this time, just chucking a million darts at the board, and the only one that stuck for an extended period seemed to be Andre Drummond, who played on the team from 2012 to the 2019-2020 season, where at only 26 years old, he would be moved to Cleveland and his career would begin to fall off. Now with the Cavs, Drummond did look like Drummond, but very quickly, as he would be moved to LA, we would see the packages in return really quickly fall off for someone who was supposed to be an all-star level player. Really, this guy wasn't worth too much at all. As a guy with a skill set closer to DeAndre Jordan than Marc Gasol, he was kind of trying to be that Marc Gasol kind of player, which was all fun and games when on a shitty Pistons squad. But with no Dwight or JaVale on these Lakers, they wanted him to fill in that role, which his skill set was better suited. And eventually, the Nets and Sixers were kind of looking for the DeAndre Drummond as well, which Andre Drummond could really no longer be as his athleticism declined. I don't take any joy or satisfaction in the fact that Andre Drummond's career went pretty downhill after his time in Detroit, but seeing Drummond open up and begin to point the finger at himself is definitely a great example for younger players. Although he was definitely out there hustling and being that energy guy on the bench, it really seemed like he was doing so to earn the reputation as the rebounding guy, and as selfishness proved to be a career killer, it in a way tarnished everything he was able to accomplish and killed his future in the process. Now, Kendrick Nunn was a guy who came from nowhere, and by the looks of things was going to be around for the long haul. After going undrafted and getting his chance on the finals run underdog 2020 Heat, Kendrick Nunn was certainly one of the bright spots of the season, finishing second in Rookie of the Year voting. I mean, the guy was 24 and closer to his ceiling than pretty much every rookie, of course, but at 15 points per game in his first year of NBA basketball, that's a lot better than a lot of players at their peak that etched out long careers in the NBA. Fast forward just a few years later, and Kendrick Nunn is out of the league entirely. It's unfortunate for sure, given that this was one of the feel-good stories of that season, but given the context and his unfortunate circumstances, it's not exactly surprising. Now, what exactly was going on in Miami that year? Well, really, when it came to scoring the ball, there was kind of some shots to go around. With Tyler Hero still in diapers, and the Heat stars and Bam Adebayo and Jimmy Buckets being very solid facilitators at their position, the shot creation ability of Kendrick Nunn was put to great use here. At 44 and 35% shooting splits, he wasn't necessarily the most efficient, but he was given a great opportunity to play in a great system that maximized his ability under coach Eric Spoelstra, who at this point really should be looked at amongst some of the best to ever do it. It was a special year that earned him recognition. Of course, second place in Rookie of the Year voting is quite the achievement, especially for undrafted talents, but come playoff time, Spo struggled to find the same magic with Nunn, cutting his minutes in half and deferring to more experienced talent like Goran Dragic to get the job done. And for this squad to make it to the finals with this talent, you really couldn't argue with the decision. It's tough to watch your team excel with a limited role comparative to what you're used to, I'm sure, but come the next season, Kendrick Nunn looked even better. At a slightly reduced 14.6 a game, Nunn was scoring on elite efficiency up near 50-40-90. I mean, there's a ton of really solid shot creators on the market, and although it's more than likely that Nunn's talents were slightly inflated given the system he was playing in, Nunn had a very impressive skill set that a bench unit near him would likely love to get their hands on. And that's exactly what happened when the Lakers snatched him up the following season, but not before a knee injury would ruin all the momentum that he was building. After a failed stint with LA and a run that mostly consisted of garbage time minutes with the Wizards, it appeared that post the arrow to the knee, he had difficulty getting to spots and creating space effectively, matched with the mental exhaustion that comes with not being what you once were. For lack of a better word, at 27 years old, Kendrick Nunn was unfortunately washed and out of the NBA. To give you a bit of a happy ending, after taking his career overseas, it looks like Nunn may have found the perfect fit for his talents. I'm not sure if his goal is making it back to an NBA roster or building a career over there, but at 20 points per game on 55% from the field and 40% from deep, I don't know too much about EuroLeague basketball, but I know enough to know this guy's playing out of his mind. This is a strangely happy ending to an otherwise pretty unfortunate fall, but in the case of Nikola Mirotic, his story is just out of the ordinary all around. Every year, NBA players head back to Europe after realizing they couldn't cut it in the NBA. Some EuroLeague MVPs have flopped hard, but that isn't the case for Nikola Mirotic. He was in his prime, had a big NBA contract waiting for him with multiple teams not putting down the phone with big-time offers for his big-time talent, yet still chose to leave the NBA to go back to Europe. And when he first explained why, he wasn't telling the whole truth. Years later, he finally revealed what happened. He finished second in Rookie of the Year voting in 2015 behind Andrew Wiggins. This guy was a big shooter, scoring double digits his whole career, while being able to create a little bit and score on 3 levels. As D Rose, Jimmy Butler, and Pau Gasol left the Bulls, it was time for Mirotic to take on a bigger role. Until a teammate literally broke his face. During a preseason practice, Mirotic and Bobby Portis got into it. Reports say Mirotic lunged at Portis twice, and Portis responded with a single punch that gave Mirotic a concussion and broke multiple bones in his face. He missed 23 games, nearly a third of the season. The Bulls suspended Portis for just 8 games, and when Mirotic demanded they chose between them, the Bulls sided with Bobby Portis. Mirotic was eventually traded to New Orleans, where he thrived, having his best days in the NBA, averaging 16 points on 43% from deep. His success led to a trade to Milwaukee, where the Bucks saw him as a key piece on a contending team, looking for third or fourth option scoring with hopes of a championship run. ESPN called the trade a grand slam, and really, it seemed to be. Despite injuries, he was a very valuable role player and entered free agency as a sought-after piece for contending teams. While vacationing back home in Greece after the season, Mirotic's agent called with a 3-year, $50 million offer from the Utah Jazz. I mean, this is big-time money any way you want to look at it. And given his age at 27 years old, this was his best and possibly his only chance to get this type of payday in his career. If he got on the plane, he was signing with Utah. But as he sat at the airport, he had a moment of clarity. Why was he even here? Instead of boarding the flights, he turned around and went back to his hotel. At 27 years old, he signed with Barcelona, making him the highest paid player in all of Europe, though still for less than the Utah offer. When asked why he left, he gave a typical answer. He felt limited in the NBA, wanted a bigger role, and believed he had yet to play his best basketball, but years later, he revealed the real answer. Mirotic has always been deeply religious and family-oriented. He and his wife had their first son in 2013, and he struggled with missing key moments. The NBA's 82-game schedule meant constant travel, time away from home, and little balance. He had a personal crisis and decided for the first time to put family over basketball. In Europe, Mirotic dominated. He won a league MVP, he won a couple titles, while still being one of the most sought-after players outside of the NBA. Many couldn't understand why he left, but by the time he finally told the truth, he had already proved himself. Even now playing in Italy, I can't imagine he wants to go back to the nation that he got his face punched in at. Kenneth Faried's name still rings a bell for tons of NBA fans, because not too long ago he was an Olympic team selection and fresh off a $50 million contract. The manimal was a force in nature, freakish putback dunks, relentless energy, and double-doubles on a nightly basis. Yet despite staying relatively healthy, Faried disappeared from the league almost without warning. After moving on from the Carmelo Anthony era, the 2011 Denver Nuggets were scrambling to rebuild. With the 22nd pick in the draft, their options were very limited, but Faried's non-stop motor made him a risk worth taking. At just 6'8" without a reliable jumper, he wasn't the prototypical power forward or anywhere close to it. But after setting the NCAA Division I rebounding record, it was clear he'd find a way to make an impact in one way or another. Despite a roster full of misfit pieces, with Danilo Gallinari providing wing scoring and Ty Lawson running the points, Denver was a high-energy team that defied expectations. They finished 38-28, and while they weren't a title contender, they were undeniably a blast to watch. No player embodied that energy more than the manimal. Faried quickly made a name for himself in the NBA. He cleaned the glass like very few, with high-flying dunks and transition play that made him a fan favorite. He earned a starting spot after the Nuggets moved on from Nene, finishing third in Rookie of the Year voting with averages of 10 points and 8 rebounds per game. His impact was immediate. He didn't need 35 minutes a night to put up an insane stat line like a 27 point, 17 rebound game in just 22 minutes. That season ended in a first-round loss to the Lakers, but the Nuggets had overachieved. A team with a 5'10 point guard, an undersized power forward, and no clear star had taken Kobe and Powell to 7 games. This wasn't just a gimmicky team. They played shockingly effective basketball, and no one poured more heart into it than Faried. Looking to capitalize on their success, the Nuggets traded for Andre Iguodala the next season. It was a good move for a team built on selflessness, pace, and relentless energy. Faried improved again, averaging 11.5 and 9 rebounds, while earning top 20 in Defensive Player of the Year voting. Denver finished the year on an insane 31-6 run, securing the 3rd seed in the West with sky-high expectations. Unfortunately, this is where it all unraveled. The Nuggets ran into a young Warriors team that in hindsight was in the beginning of a new era. Golden State's efficiency exposed Denver's flaws, and they fell in 6 games. That series wasn't just the end of a promising season, it was the beginning of the Nuggets' decline. Coach of the Year George Karl was fired, Iguodala left in free agency, Gallinari suffered a major injury. Faried, however, was the one who took another leap forward, averaging 14 points and 9 rebounds in 27 minutes. He was rewarded with a spot on Team USA and a massive $50 million contract. At this point, it seemed like Faried was on the verge of something special, but in reality, his downfall had just begun. That summer, the Nuggets drafted Jusuf Nurkic and Nikola Jokic. Though it wasn't immediately obvious, Denver had just drafted his replacements. Faried continued to put up respectable numbers for a couple more seasons, but cracks in his game became too big to ignore. He was an elite energy guy, but energy alone wasn't enough. His lack of a jumper, post move, or any real offensive versatility made him easy to scheme against. Defensively, his hustle was undeniable, but at 6'8", he struggled on the glass against bigger players and wasn't a great shot blocker or help defender. By the 2016-2017 season, nagging back injuries and the emergence of younger, more skilled bigs pushed him out of the rotation. He dropped to 9 points per game, then 6 the following season. When asked about Faried's dwindling minutes, Coach Michael Malone bluntly stated, "Why should I play him?" At just 28 years old, Faried was expendable. Denver moved on and he landed in Houston, a team that seemed like the perfect fit. The Rockets had found success with undersized energy bigs like PJ Tucker and Clint Capella. For a moment, it looked like Faried was making a comeback. He averaged 13 points and 8 rebounds in a brief stint with the Rockets. But even in the best possible system, his flaws were glaring. He wasn't a reliable offensive threat, struggled to defend, and was a liability in an analytics-driven NBA that prioritized efficiency. And just like that, he was done. Faried's rapid exit from the NBA seemed shocking, but in reality, the writing had been on the wall for years. He was never as good as his raw numbers suggested. And as the league evolved, his limitations became impossible to ignore. His athleticism and energy were elite, but his skill set never expanded whatsoever. Despite a massive payday and early career accolades, Faried coasted instead of adapting. You guys remember the debates Warriors fans used to have about whether the team should build around Steph Curry or Monta Ellis. Back in the late 2000s, this was a real argument. At his peak, Monta was an electrifying 6'3" combo guard, blazing fast, dangerous off the pick and roll, and capable of finishing at the rim or knocking down jumpers in the mid-range. He was putting up big-time numbers, even scoring 26 points per game in the playoffs just a few years before his career came to an end. So, what happened to him? Monta Ellis was drafted to the Warriors in the second round of the 2005 draft. After a quiet rookie season where he averaged just 7 points on 41% shooting, he broke out in his second year, putting up 17 points and 4 assists per game as part of the legendary We Believe Warriors team that shocked the world by upsetting the top-seeded Mavericks in the playoffs. The next season, he took another leap, averaging 20 points and 4 assists while shooting an incredible 53% from the field, his most efficient season ever. At this point, Monta looked like a future franchise player, but then things took a turn. In the summer of 2008, Ellis tore a ligament in his ankle. Initially, he told the team it happened while working out, but it was later revealed that he actually got injured in a moped accident, a direct violation of his contract. The Warriors responded by suspending him for 30 games, and when he finally returned, he didn't quite look the same. To make things more complicated, the team drafted Steph Curry in 2009, which created tension between the two guards. At Media Day that year, when a reporter asked Monta if he could see himself and Curry thriving together, his response was brutally honest. He flat out said he didn't like the idea of playing alongside another small guard. The comments caused an awkward situation with the organization, and even Monte's wife had to step in, telling him he needed to apologize. Eventually, he let go his frustrations, cleared things up with Curry, and moved forward. Despite Monte's concerns, the two played together for a few seasons. In 2010, Ellis had arguably his best statistical year, leading the team in scoring with 25 points per game. At one point, he even claimed he was the second best player in the league behind Kobe Bryant. But as good as he was, his inefficiency and ball dominance became major issues. In his final season with the Warriors, he averaged 21 points but needed 19 shots per game to get there. The front office had a decision to make: continue building around Monta or commit to Steph Curry. Warriors fans were split at the time, with many believing Monta was so much better of a player. And when the team traded him to Milwaukee for Andrew Bogut in 2012, fans were furious. They even booed the owner at Chris Mullin's jersey retirement ceremony over the decision. Ellis' time in Milwaukee didn't go too good. He was once again paired with another ball-dominant undersized guard in Brandon Jennings, which led to an inefficient and awkward fit. His second and final season with the Bucks saw him average 19 points and 6 assists, but on rough efficiency at just 41% from the field and 28% from 3. In 2013, Monta signed with the Mavericks, hoping to provide Dirk Nowitzki with one final contending push. In Dallas, he played his most efficient team-oriented basketball, leading the Mavs in assists and steals while being their second leading scorer. His 37-point performance against Phoenix in the final stretch of the season helped secure a playoff spot. The Mavs pushed the eventual champions to 7 games in the first round, nearly pulling off a massive upset. The following season, Monta was once again the team's leading scorer, and he delivered big in the playoffs, averaging 26 points on improved efficiency against the Rockets. But despite his strong play, the writing was on the wall. His days as a top option were numbered. In 2015, the Pacers signed Ellis to a 4-year, $44 million contract, but his production declined rapidly. His quickness, once his greatest weapon, started to fade. His ability to finish at the rim diminished, and his weaknesses in poor shooting, lackluster defense, and an inability to play off the ball became very glaring. In his second season with Indiana, he lost his starting job to Glenn Robinson III. The Pacers eventually waived him in 2017, and he never played another NBA game. So what happened to Monta Ellis? Well, for one, his game was built around speed, agility, and the ability to get to the rim. Once those skills declined, he had no reliable outside shot or defensive ability to fall back on. The modern NBA demands guards who can space the floor and play off of it, two things Monta never mastered. Thank you guys for watching. If you made it this far, subscribe if you're new. We're trying to hit 100,000 this year, and I'll see you boys in the next one. Peace out.